spinning sword techniques, dual-wielding warriors, and weapons cutting through armor like butter. Medieval combat movies are fantasy with historical costumes. Real weapons weren't about looking cool, they were about ending fights fast. Forget choreographed duels. Medieval weapons meant brutal efficiency in mass combat chaos. Every movie sword fight becomes laughably unrealistic. Hollywood treats swords like they're the ultimate medieval weapon, but here's the reality. Most medieval soldiers rarely used them. Swords were expensive, required years of training, and weren't even the best choice for most combat situations. A quality blade cost more than most peasants earned in several years of backbreaking labor. The longsword techniques you see in movies are complete nonsense. Real medieval swordsmanship wasn't about flashy spinning attacks or dramatic overhead swings. It was about controlling distance, binding your opponent's blade, and creating openings for quick strikes. Medieval fighting manuals show techniques that look more like wrestling with sharp objects than elegant fencing. German masters like Johannes Lichtenauer developed complex systems focused on leverage and timing rather than brute force attacks. Half-swording was common, grabbing your sword blade with one hand to use it like a short spear against armored opponents. Movie audiences would think the fighter was insane, but it worked because sword points could slip between armor plates while edges bounced off steel. Pommel strikes were probably more deadly than sword cuts. The weighted pommel could crush skulls through helmets. Medieval fighters would end them rightly by unscrewing their pommel and throwing it, a technique so effective it became a period meme. The biggest myth is that swords could cut through armor. They couldn't. Well-made mail or plate armor stopped sword cuts completely. That's why real combat involved grappling. Fighters would wrestle for position and try to find gaps for daggers or sword points. Dual-wielding swords is pure Hollywood fantasy. Fighting with two swords is like writing with both hands simultaneously. Awkward and stupid. Real fighters occasionally use sword and dagger combinations, but never two full-size swords. While movies obsess over swords, the real workhorses of medieval combat were spears and polearms. These weapons dominated battlefields for one simple reason. They were devastatingly effective and relatively easy to use. Spear formations were the backbone of medieval armies. Rows of spear points created an impenetrable wall that cavalry couldn't charge and infantry couldn't penetrate. The key wasn't individual skill, it was collective discipline. Break formation and everyone dies. Hold formation and you're nearly unstoppable. Pike squares were the medieval equivalent of machine gun nests. Swiss pikemen with 18-foot spears could stop heavy cavalry charges that had dominated European warfare for centuries. A horse won't run into spear points, and knights couldn't reach pikemen with shorter weapons. Halberds were probably the most versatile weapons ever developed. They combined a spear point for thrusting, an axe blade for cutting, and a hook for pulling riders off horses. A competent halberdier could handle any opponent, infantry, cavalry, or heavily armored knights. The glaive wasn't some exotic fantasy weapon, it was a farming tool turned into an incredibly effective polearm. The curved blade could slice through multiple opponents in one swing, while the long handle kept enemies at distance. Peasant armies with glaives regularly defeated noble cavalry. Poleaxes were specifically designed for armored combat. The axe blade could crush helmets, the hammerhead could dent armor, and the spear point could pierce gaps. A knight with a poleax was exponentially more dangerous than one with a sword. Movies treat bows like they're barely more effective than thrown rocks, but medieval archers were the snipers of their time. These weapons could kill from distances that made close combat irrelevant. Crossbows were game changers because they required minimal training. A peasant could learn crossbow use effectively in weeks, while longbow mastery took decades. More importantly, crossbow bolts could punch through the finest armor at close range. Knights who'd spent fortunes on protection found themselves vulnerable to relatively cheap weapons. The mechanical advantage of the crossbow's steel prod generated tremendous force that human muscle alone couldn't match. English longbows were even more devastating in the right hands. Experienced longbowmen could loose 12 arrows per minute with incredible accuracy. The bodkin point arrows they used weren't designed to cause bleeding, they were armor-piercing rounds that could penetrate mail and some plate armor. Volley fire was the key tactical innovation. Individual archers shooting at specific targets were effective, but massed archery was devastating. Hundreds of arrows falling simultaneously created chaos that broke unit cohesion. Even if arrows didn't kill immediately, wounded horses and men disrupted enemy tactics. The psychological warfare aspect was crucial. The sound of hundreds of arrows in flight was reportedly terrifying, a hissing noise that preceded mass casualties. Soldiers would break formation, trying to avoid volleys, making them more vulnerable to follow-up attacks. Medieval archers weren't noble heroes movies portray. They were professional killers who understood their job was thinning enemy ranks before close combat began. Chivalric codes didn't apply to ranged weapons. Archers shot anything in enemy colors. Hollywood loves sharp, shiny weapons, but the most effective medieval weapons were often blunt instruments designed to crush rather than cut. When everyone's wearing armor, hitting harder beats, hitting sharper. War hammers weren't the massive two-handed weapons fantasy games portray. They were carefully balanced one-handed tools with weighted heads designed to concentrate force. A war hammer could cave in a helmet, crush arm bones through armor, or shatter ribs through mail. The spike on the back was for piercing armor at close range. Professional soldiers preferred them over swords when fighting heavily armored opponents because physics favored blunt force trauma. Maces were the ultimate anti-armor weapons. The flanged heads concentrated impact force, while the flanges themselves could catch on armor and deliver twisting damage. A good mace hit could disable an opponent even without breaking bones. Getting hit by a steel club tends to end fights quickly. Morning Stars combined the crushing power of maces with penetrating spikes. The multiple spikes meant at least one would find a gap in armor, while the weighted head delivered maximum impact. These weren't elegant weapons, they were designed for maximum damage as quickly as possible. Flails were probably the most feared blunt weapons because they were nearly impossible to block effectively. The chain connection meant the head could wrap around shields and parrying weapons. More importantly, flails moved unpredictably, making them difficult to defend against. The psychological impact was enormous. Getting crushed by a mace meant broken bones, internal injuries, and slow death. The threat of blunt force trauma often broke enemy morale before combat began. Movies show medieval combat as individual duels with plenty of time for dramatic dialogue and elaborate techniques. Real medieval battles were chaotic, exhausting affairs where survival depended on teamwork, endurance, and luck. Most combat was over in seconds, not minutes. Real fights between skilled opponents ended quickly because someone made a mistake or got lucky. The long battles in movies would be physically impossible. Full armor weighs 40 to 60 pounds, and swinging weapons in that gear is exhausting. Battle fatigue set in rapidly, forcing fighters to conserve energy and pick their moments carefully rather than sustaining action. Formation fighting was everything. Individual skill mattered less than the ability to work as part of a unit. The best swordsman was useless if he couldn't coordinate with teammates or maintain formation under pressure. Medieval armies won through discipline and teamwork, not individual heroics. Fatigue was the real enemy. After a few minutes of combat in full armor, fighters were gasping for air and struggling to lift weapons. Battles often paused not for dramatic effect, but because everyone needed rest. The side with better endurance usually won. Weapon maintenance was crucial in ways movies never show. Swords got nicked and dulled, arrows ran out, bowstrings snapped, and armor got damaged. Real fighters carried repair tools and backup weapons because equipment failure meant death. Weather and terrain affected everything. Mud made cavalry charges impossible, rain made archery ineffective, and cold weather made metal armor conduct heat away from the body. Medieval fighters adapted to conditions movies ignore. The real lesson of medieval combat is that it wasn't about honor, skill, or noble ideals. It was about survival in the most brutal circumstances imaginable. Weapons weren't chosen for their elegance or symbolic value, but for their ability to end fights quickly and efficiently. Medieval weapons weren't the elegant instruments of war that movies portray. They were tools designed by people who understood that combat is ultimately about physics, psychology, and the brutal reality that the side inflicting more damage faster usually wins. Every sword, spear, and mace was engineered around one simple principle: end the fight before the other guy ends you. And once you understand that truth, every movie weapon fight becomes a fantasy sequence rather than a historical recreation. The battlefield wasn't a stage for heroic duels. It was a killing ground where the only rule was survival, and the weapons that succeeded were the ones that made survival possible.